Hi everyone and welcome back to the Early Bird Photo News. There have been so many wild rumors about the R5 Mark II and the R1 and all the crazy specs floating around that it's kind of hard to know what's real or if any of that is real at all. So this week I've spoken to some of my trusted sources that have been right about Canon releases in the past. So in this video we're going to find out what they have to say. And I've also managed to negotiate a special discount for all followers of this channel from an awesome brand. So let's jump right in. Last week, Canon Rumors released a list of specs that they were quite confident in that they're actually the real specs or part of the real specs of a potential R5 Mark II. And I've been reading through them and I think they sound quite reputable. It would make sense if the camera had these specs, and at the same time they also sound awesome. So I think that would be a very good start. They say that the camera will have 45 megapixels and no mechanical shutter. No mechanical shutter in return would mean, for me at least, that it should have also a stacked sensor, which means it has enough fast readout speed so we don't have to deal with the rolling shutter. If it didn't have a mechanical shutter and a slow non-stack sensor, that would be kind of crazy to me, because then we would basically have rolling shutter in all our images, and that's definitely not something we want. So fingers crossed we're actually gonna get that 45 megapixel stack sensor. I'm very happy with the resolution of 45 megapixels. I don't really think I would need 60 or 80 or more, so I think 45 is still kind of a sweet spot at the moment. Another spec that I would definitely welcome is that it will shoot in up to 60 frames per second. The current R5 shoots at up to 20 frames per second, and that's definitely enough for most applications, but sometimes you just wished you had an extra button that you could press to get some more shots in a peak action moment, something like the new Sony A9 III has. There's one button that you can assign to the lens or to the camera, and whenever you press it and hold it, the camera will shoot at 120 frames per second, and if you let go, it will revert back to your normal frames per second. So this is something I would love to see in a Canon R5 Mark II as well. For instance, you can shoot at 20 frames per second in your normal mode, and if you press a button, it will jump to 60 frames per second and then back to 20 frames per second. Because let's be honest, no one really wants to shoot at 60 frames per second all the time. That would fill up your buffer like crazy and you would get endless amounts of images, and in most situations you wouldn't really need it. So having the ability to shoot at a lower frame rate and then boost it up for those peak action moments is what I would love to see in the R5 Mark II as well, and this is something I loved about using the Sony A9 III. I already mentioned the buffer, and I think this is one area where Canon could dramatically improve. I'm not only talking about the size of the buffer, but also how it works. When you shoot Nikon or Sony, for instance, you can never actually hit zero on your buffer. When you hit the buffer, your frame rate will slow down, but you can still take pictures. Whereas on Canon, if you hit the zero on your buffer, you fill your buffer completely. It can take 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds sometimes until you can shoot again. And in nature photography, especially if there's action happening, that's an eternity, and the moment is most likely gone. So I would love to see Canon to implement a new technology there that allows you to continuously keep shooting, even if it's at a reduced frame rate and you're not being blocked from shooting completely, because that is super annoying and frustrating in the field. When it comes to the buffer size as well, I think it needs also some improvements, because if we look at an R6 Mark II, for instance, that shoots at 40 frames per second, and even if you use C-RAW, you will buffer out after just 1 or 2 seconds. So I think an R5 Mark II, and especially the R1, will need a dramatically increased buffer in size, but also in how it works. With a lot of other brands, the buffer is not really an issue in the field, whereas with Canon, it's still something that really restricts you from time to time, so I would love to see that go. Another feature that Canon Rumors didn't specifically state, but I'm sure the R5 Mark II will have, is the pre-capture feature, and this will be very welcome for nature photography. However, we need a good implementation of it. The current Canon implementation, where it kind of fills your buffer and then stops you from shooting after you've used the pre-capture, is really not usable in the field. What I would love to see is something similar to the Sony A9 Mark III, where you simply set a certain amount of time between 0.1 and 1 second, and then the camera will just take 3, 4, up to maybe 10 photos whenever you half press the shutter button, depending on whatever time you have dialed in. And that way you just have a few images before you actually press the shutter button, so you're not taking too many images, but the images are also just saved like all the other RAW files on your memory card, and you don't have to extract them from a separate file, and you don't have any issues with your buffer. So a better implementation of the pre-capture would also be something that I would love to see in Canon. And also I would want it to be shooting at 14-bit RAWs in the pre-capture and across all other modes. And no matter what camera you're using, I think one area where most of you could improve their photography the most is actually to improve your image editing. And I would love to help you with that with my pro sets, my masterclass, and my brush pack. And I've linked these for you down there in the description. With my pro sets, I allow you with just one click to get amazing results from your raw files. And in my masterclass, I teach you step by step everything you need to know in Photoshop so you can follow along. And with my brush pack, I make your life in Photoshop that little bit easier. So make sure to check these out down there in the description. So now that we've hyped up the R5 Mark II, when is it actually gonna come out? And I've spoken to my sources and they have actually still not heard too much about the camera. The only thing they seem to be certain about is that it's not going to be released anytime soon. The only thing they said we might get is maybe a development announcement in maybe April or May, but beyond that they think it's quite unlikely that the camera will be available anytime before like late July or August. So fingers crossed that we will get a development announcement at least with some specs in the next month or so, but after that we'll probably have to wait another few months before we can actually get the camera. Just to fuel the fire a little bit more, my sources also mentioned one quite interesting thing to me, and that is that they believe that the R5 Mark II and the R1 will be quite a big jump ahead from the current technology, almost similar to how the initial R5 was perceived when it was first released. So that excited me for sure, that they thought that these cameras will be quite a big jump and not just a minor upgrade. This also makes me hopeful that the rumors in the past of the R1 only being 30 megapixels are not true, because no one's really getting excited about a 30 megapixel flagship camera when we already have the A1 and the Z9 in the 50 megapixel range. I know many people say in the past Canon's flagship cameras always had low megapixels, but we already have an R3 with a lower megapixel, so I don't think having an R1 in a similar range makes a lot of sense. But either way, I'm hopeful that we will see some very exciting and awesome cameras very soon. What are the upcoming cameras that you guys are most excited in? The R5 Mark II, the R1, maybe an A1 Mark II, or something like a Nikon Z6 Mark III? Let me know in the comments. I'm also still wondering how will Canon differentiate the R5 Mark II from the R1 other than the body and the price? Because currently it seems like the R5 Mark II is already a kind of amazing and very crazy camera. So how could Canon step up from the specs of the R5 Mark II to an R1 to make it even better? When Sony invited me to Sydney a few weeks ago, I wasn't only able to connect with some amazing people and use that awesome gear, but I was also able to actually field test for the first time my brand new backpacks. In this case, the Fjord 36 liters from Naya Evil. I got these backpacks a few weeks ago and I showed them to you in one video already, but now I could finally field test them for the first time when it comes to flying in an airplane. And we all know this is always super annoying. And even though I was traveling light, I still managed to somehow pack too many things in my backpack and I struggled at the gate. But after a little bit of negotiation, I was actually able to go through with a slightly heavier backpack. But I'm sure all of you know as well that feeling when they say, please put your backpack on the scales, and you know it's not going to be a happy moment when you see the result. I'm still field testing both of the backpacks, but so far they have impressed me a lot. I've used the smaller one more so far, especially on my travels, but also the big one I've packed a few times, and what I love about it, it does fit my 600mm RF lens with an attached f5. So if you have a Sony lens or a Nikon 600mm prime lens, it will fit in even easier because the Canon RF 600mm f4 lens is the largest of these lenses, and having a backpack where I can fit my big lens, my big prime lens with an attached camera is amazing because it's so much easier to just rip out your camera in the field and you can basically start shooting right away. Another reason I organized some new backpacks for myself was that I needed a new pack for the 200 to 800mm lens because my smaller packs were too small and my bigger packs from the past were all too big. And I'm happy to report that the 200 to 800mm lens with an attached f5 fits perfectly into the Fjord 36 liter backpack. But the large RCI doesn't only fit the 200 to 800mm lens with an f5, it also fits a few extra cameras and a few extra lenses. Or if you want to travel with a bigger lens like a 100 to 500mm lens on top of the 200 to 800mm lens, that also fits into that backpack. So in terms of size and shape and weight, I really love this backpack and I can fit everything I need into that backpack when I want to travel lighter. Now believe it or not, but my favorite piece of equipment is actually not the backpacks, but this tiny little RCI extra small. So this fits inside the backpacks, but at the same time this can also be your own little tiny camera bag with a strap. And believe it or not, this actually fits my 100 to 500mm lens with an attached f5 as well. In Sydney, for instance, I didn't need a lot of camera gear during the day and I want to travel light, so I packed this small RCI with a r5 24-105 and a 14-35mm lens and just grabbed that out of my backpack whenever I needed to walk around. So having that tiny little RCI has worked really well for me as well. And overall, I'm super impressed with the product so far. I'm looking forward to using them more in the field. And the best thing is, I was able to negotiate a special deal with the founders of the company for you guys following this channel. So if you want to check out some of their products and see if they might fit your needs, make sure to check out these websites down there in the description. There's one for Europe and one for the rest of the world. And if you punch in NatureBag10 at the checkout, you will get a 10% discount and you can't get that anywhere else. While I'm making this video, Nikon has also just released firmware 5.0 for the Nikon Z9, their flagship camera. And while it has a big number, 5.0, it doesn't seem like it's a substantial firmware up there with huge major improvements or lots of new features added. There's some nice new features added, like some refinements for the auto capture, for instance. Now you can set a certain date and time for the auto capture to work. So that's nice if you're at some event, for instance, and you don't want the camera to just continuously capture people walking past. You can set it to the starting time of the event and only then the auto capture will work for a certain period of time. That's definitely good. And there's some more great features added for sports photographers. For instance, now you can select certain presets that will allow you to mitigate the flickering of the LED boards. Besides that, nothing too crazy has been added. A few features that the Z8 and the Nikon ZF already had, but the Z9 didn't have now also been added, for instance, like better high-res zoom control. So all in all, a nice update, but nothing too crazy. Are you going to update those at 9? Now that we just talked about smaller backpacks, I might actually need a bigger backpack because it sounds like Canon will also be announcing an f4 200-500mm lens sometime later this year. In the past, we've already heard some rumors about this lens, and Canon rumor seems to be pretty certain that this lens will come out this year. My sources haven't heard anything about this lens, but since Canon rumor seems to be very adamant that it will be coming out, I expect it to be coming out sometime later this year. Looking at the 100-300mm lens that Canon already released, this lens would make a lot of sense and would fit perfectly into the lineup. The only downside will likely be the potential size and definitely the price. Nikon made some big headlines this week when they acquired Red Cameras, a high-end cinema camera manufacturer. At first glance, that might seem a little bit strange, but when we look closer into it, I think it makes a lot of sense because other than Canon and Sony, Nikon currently doesn't have any high-end cinema cameras. And I think this is definitely an area with high margins where the companies can still make a lot of profit as well. So Nikon acquiring a manufacturer and then maybe using some of that technology in future Nikon cinema cameras would probably make a lot of sense. What's quite ironic about the purchase is though that most of the newer Red cameras actually have a Canon RF mount, and that definitely begs the question, is Nikon going to sell Red cameras with an RF Canon mount, or are they going to rejig the cameras and put a Nikon Z mount onto them, for instance? Although currently Nikon doesn't actually have a lot of cinema lenses, so they would definitely have to produce some more of their own lenses, but that's definitely an interesting area because I don't really think Nikon wants to go ahead and sell Canon RF mount cameras, will they? Another reason Nikon may have acquired Red cameras is that they hold a lot of important patents, especially when it comes to raw compression algorithms. And in the past, Red cameras had actually sued Nikon for patent infringement. So maybe at this stage Nikon thought enough is enough, we're just gonna buy the whole camera, we're gonna buy all the patents so we don't have to fight Red cameras over the patents and these compression algorithms for raw video all the time. And owning these patents can also be quite valuable going forward for Nikon. So in that sense, it also makes a lot of sense that they acquired the company. What I found interesting and kind of amusing at times was that there was a lot of outrage from Red users and Sony users that didn't like Nikon acquiring Red cameras. I suppose there's always a little bit of a stigma attached when it comes to sort of cinema cameras because Nikon hasn't really done it in the past and people don't really know what to expect. But at the same time, I think for Nikon overall as a company, it's very good. But at the same time, I can also see how some people that felt like they were in the exclusive Red club might feel like that if a mainstream manufacturer comes in and messes with a camera, it might kind of take away from some of the products. But only time will tell, I think. There haven't been a lot of Sony news this week, but one that I found quite interesting that Sony Alpha Rumors posted is that Sony had been working on some codecs that would allow you to shoot 4K at 240 frames per second. And that would definitely be something that I would love to shoot in the field. For instance, if you're doing slow motion of hummingbirds, it would be awesome to have a higher frame rate than just 120 frames per second. And on that note, it's time to wrap up this week's Early Bird Photo News. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please make sure to let me know all your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button and of course hit that subscribe button. And also check out my channel membership, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye guys.